All right, we are live here on the Sumer Sports Show. Yet again, this is Parker Fleming and my colleague Tej Seth filling in for Thomas Dimitrov and Eric Eager, who are often parts unknown, doing very very important, very serious business. So they've left the podcast to us just for today, and excited to be here again with Tej. I think we got some good things to talk about today, specifically about the draft and about quarterbacks and about team building. So that should be a lot of fun. Tej, how are you, man?
Really good. Yeah, thanks again for introducing, and yeah, excited again to be here. And I think this is a really fun time of the year because we're coming off all like the Super Bowl hangover type stuff where you have the week to digest the whole season, and then now we can really turn our focus to the draft. I was listening to Detroit Sports Talk Radio over the weekend, and they already were doing multiple segments on the draft, even glossing over free agency. And so that's how you really know it's the time of year to start talking about this stuff.
Man, and the draft Twitter just well, draft Twitter just hits you so hard and so fast, man. It comes out of nowhere and it's like drinking out of a fire hose. We've got takes left and right. We've got attempted dunkings left and right. It becomes pretty crazy here, but hopefully we'll be able to cut through some of the noise and have some level-headed talk and some level-headed takes. Tage, before we get to all that, I do have to ask. You talked about football being over. I want to challenge you on that a little bit. The XFL this weekend was not bad. There were moments of honest to God, real competitive, compelling football. And I, for one, was excited. Did you get to catch any of the games?
I did get to see the replay of the comeback where one of the teams was down by 12 with a minute 30 to go, scored a touchdown. The 3-point conversion that they have in the XFL went for the 4th and 15, converted it, and then scored another touchdown to win the game. And I just think that's such a cool way to win between converting a 3-point conversion, something that we don't have in the NFL or college, and then going for the 4th and 15, where you have the opportunity to put it in your offense's hands instead of something fluky like an onside kick. Is such a better way to kind of decide who should get the ball. So that I think was a really cool moment for the XFL. I know our friend Sam Schwartzstein like designed a lot of these rules that are being used this year, and like he did a really, really good job with them for sure.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, and they're trying things, and there are guys out there who legitimately look like they can play football a little bit, and so it'll be interesting to see how it goes over the course of the season. But was nice little you get to scratch the itch just a little bit this weekend and watch some of these games, and I think the comeback was great. I think the Arlington game, they stopped the 2-point conversion to win at the end, and so there's some seriously fun moments with some teams who I think a couple of them will be competitive. And not everyone will be a disaster, which will be fun to watch. I think from the standpoint of, hey, we put a league together and still a work in progress, and they're putting a good product on the field. So let's turn our attention away from the XFL because I would talk about it for the next 50 minutes. But let's turn our attention to something more pressing and dive into a little bit of this of draft season. When we found out that we were going to fill in today, I think both of our immediate thought was, let's talk about quarterbacks. I feel like that's kind of the most fun thing that we can do. It's something you and I talk about offline a ton, and it is one of like the most important questions in football today is how do we know if a quarterback is going to transcend from college success to pro success? In some cases, how do we know if a college quarterback is going to transcend from being just okay in college to being great in the NFL? And should a team take it? How should they approach quarterbacks in the draft as assets on rookie deals? All of that. We're going to get into that at length today. Before we do, just want to say, make sure you're following at Sumer Sports on the on the Twitter and on the YouTube as well. Trying to bump those numbers up, trying to provide good, just kind of level-headed, factual content that helps you understand the game of football in a different way. So hopefully that's all been beneficial and you're following those already. But make sure that you have liked and subscribed and all of that good stuff. Tej, enough with the introduction. Let's start talking about quarterbacks. Where do you want to start? Where do you want to dive in to this kind of general array of this big problem of quarterbacks in the NFL?
Yeah, we had to talk about quarterbacks today. When a pinch hitter fills in, they're not going to strike out looking, right? Like they're going to swing for the fences here. So we're the pinch hitters in this situation. And I want to start with basically an overarching look at how we currently look at quarterbacks as a whole, going from college to pro. And I think the first thing that you have to say about it is no one has really shown that they can figure out scouting quarterbacks from college to pro. It's probably one of the toughest things, if not the toughest thing, that a GM front office has to do in all of football. And that's not an indictment on film or numbers in particular. Like both film and numbers have continuously had their hits and had their misses from the quarterback position. And when you kind of look at it from a stat standpoint, we can see that you want to kind of use certain stats to help like look at quarterbacks college to pro, but there's nothing that's like the end all be all, right? So we start all the way back with The Loser's Curse by Cade Massey and Richard Thaler, where they wrote about the market efficiency and inefficiencies in the NFL draft and how it's really hard to draft a quarterback. And when you're continuously drafting in the top 10, because of how rare these picks hit compared to what you think they would hit, if someone were to explain the rules for you, it's difficult to build up your roster from that standpoint. And then we kind of moved on to 2008. David Lewin at ESPN wrote that he found the two best predictors of success from college to pro is completion percentage and games started, which was simple yet effective, but again, didn't tell the whole story. Josh Hermsmeyer looked at this for 538 in 2019 and found completion percentage over expected is a pretty good indicator of pro success. But again, it only has a relatively low R squared value compared to all these things. So from a stats perspective, there's nothing that can give like how well their expected points added per play is going to be in the NFL that we have found yet, but we are getting closer as a community, I think, getting there from that perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that's a good overview and kind of a summary there. And I think it's interesting to ask like why completion percentage on its own, like why wouldn't completion percentage in games started be a good predictor of or not tell the whole story, even if it is a good predictor of NFL success. And I think it's funny to look at like the leaderboard, for instance, of 2023 draftable quarterbacks. And completion percentage. Number one, Jake Haener from Fresno State, 72.9%. We'll talk about him later. Tommy DeVito from Illinois, 69.6%. Not exactly getting a first round grade on Tommy DeVito, I don't think. Dorian Thompson Robinson from UCLA, 69.4%. Hendon Hooker from Tennessee, 69.2% completion. And rounding out the top five, Curtis Rourke, 69.0% completion. You've got to scroll down to 12th and CJ Stroud to find a kind of top tier draftable prospect of in 2023 on the 2022 completion board or completions leaderboard. 65.7 for Stroud, 65.0 for Levis, and 64.1 for Bryce Young, all right there kind of in that 10 to 15 range. So completion percentage obviously doesn't tell us who they played, the quality of competition. It doesn't tell us the style of offense that they ran. Will Rogers at Mississippi State, for instance, running just the shortest of all air raids, has a very high completion percentage. But obviously we don't think that's going to translate. We have reason to think that might not translate. It doesn't talk about depth of target. It doesn't talk about game state. It doesn't talk about wide receiver talent. So it does leave a lot unsaid. And I will say, just kind of from a nerdy standpoint, the number of games you play in college is going to be certainly endogenous with the number of games you play in the NFL, just because like health and reps are going to be consistent over years. So yes, like there are a lot of guys who play a lot of games and don't touch the NFL, but conditional on playing in the NFL, you're going to have played a lot of games in college. Those are just going to go together kind of on its face with the endogeneity between those two variables there.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And yeah, when you read off the completion percentage leaderboard, I think that shows like kind of the way things were happening in 2008 when David Lewin wrote that article for ESPN, and how things have changed now, where Josh Hermsmeyer found that you have to use completion percentage over expected, and that's a better predictor where you adjust for pass depth and how open the receiver is and game situation variables. Or you have Kevin Cole's perspective on this whole thing that he wrote for PFF a year ago, where he found that sack avoidance and scramble yards were the two best predictors of NFL play. And I think that shows how these modern NFL quarterbacks are handling these situations. When you kind of look at what Mahomes' superpower was in college, it was really his sack avoidance. And that has translated to the NFL, where he had the second best pressure to sack ratio in the league this year. And that's like something that I think you can like Mahomes is obviously an exception in a lot of ways, but I think that's something that you want to see in your quarterbacks as you go through that. And then scramble yards is another thing. When you're looking for a quarterback, they have such a wider leash or a longer leash when they can scramble. I think Josh Allen not being that good of a passer his first 2 years in the league, but having that rushing ability on design rushes on scrambles, let him be able to make it to year 3 where he's able to get the opportunity to be able to improve his passing. And he did do that, while you have more of a pocket passer like Zach Wilson, who's been a really, really bad passer his first 2 years and doesn't have that rushing ability to kind of keep him in the starting position. So like the Jets, for example, are moving on and looking for a different quarterback.
Yeah, and bringing up the scramble yards, I think gets really, really interesting because again, you go to the leaderboard of college football of who's high on scramble yards in 2023, and you've got Dorian Thompson-Robinson, Anthony Richardson. They're top 2 of the 2023 draft class, and then it drops off. You've got Clayton Tune, Hendon Hooker, kind of down there, and then Bryce Young at 18 is kind of the leader of the elite quarterbacks there with his 308 scramble yards. Only -2 designed run yards, and he only had one designed run that didn't go well for Bryce Young, evidently in the regular season last year. But that ability, I think, is so interesting because it speaks to, or the recognition of that ability is something that translates from the college ranks to the NFL is so interesting because I think it does 2 things. One, it highlights kind of the like lesser evil approach of quarterbacking, which is for the most part with quarterbacking in like college football, especially if you can avoid like boneheaded, just disaster plays, you're gonna be okay. Your team is gonna function at a decent level and hit close to their ceiling, hit close to their 75th percentile outcome with relative ease. If you can just avoid catastrophic plays, look at DJU at Clemson and how he had some moments where, man, it looks like he's got a really good deep ball. He can throw, he can run, but he just kept having these just catastrophic turnovers that kind of plagued them, brought them down. So the relative underappreciated value of turning a what could be a very bad play, a sack fumble, a turnover there into a throwaway, which might still be negative or 0 EPA, but is not as bad negative 0 EPA as one of those kind of disaster plays. Is I think that's Cole's point for sure. Secondly, it does really highlight how important adaptability at the quarterback position is. It's not enough that you can just go out there and run a scheme and throw the ball to grass. You've got to be able to get to your second and third reads. And with the quality of edge rushers in the NFL, with the quality of defense kind of back on the rise in the NFL, in this ever moving pendulum of offense and defense that are swinging against each other in the NFL. You've got to have a quarterback who can not only extend plays, but then create after the extension, right? There's like hierarchies of quarterback ability. One, can you just make an open throw? And in college football, we get a filter of a lot of guys where that's just not going to consistently happen. So you get past that threshold. We think, okay, can you get your second or third reads? Can you get your second or third reads under duress? And then fourth would be the Mahomes play. Can you run around for a little bit, survive, make something happen, and put a ball on a tight window for a touchdown? And so those kind of, you think about quarterbacks in terms of those hierarchies, and you understand why we keep whittling down these numbers of guys who might be successful NFL quarterbacks. And so I think that sack avoidance and the scramble yard stat really does speak to those third and fourth order concerns about can you create, can you extend plays, and then create off the top of that.
That's a great point. I do think sack avoidance is probably the most underrated aspect of quarterback play. It's rarely discussed on talk shows and different stuff like that. And when you look at a sack and the average EPA lost on a sack, it's 1.75 in the NFL this past season. That's equivalent to a 21-yard gain. And I do think that if a quarterback were to have 10 21-yard gains and 10 sacks that they could have avoided, the 20-yard gains would probably be something that were more remembered because sacks often get placed on the offensive line, or sacks kind of get lost in the rhythm of things if, you know, a penalty were to happen on that same series. And that's why I think like sacks are maybe not something that teams are considering as much when going from college to pro. But as the research has shown, as you talked about here with just observational data, like looking at how these quarterbacks kind of move, and it's like something that I think can translate really well. And on top of that, like when we kind of transition to the next thing we want to talk about here, like when you have a quarterback that is maybe making a couple mistakes or maybe putting the ball in harm way, like their rookie year or their second year in the league, it's better than if you have a quarterback that you've signed to an extension that's doing that and significantly better. Like the surplus value of taking a quarterback in the first round is one of the biggest advantages of football right now. And whatever quarterback ends up being taken number one overall this year, they will have the 17th highest average per year in the league right now, which is below Jameis Winston and above Marcus Mariota. So right in between those two kind of middling quarterback contracts in the league. And when you look at what kind of can win in the league right now and what you're able to do if you have a quarterback like Jared Goff, for example, who's making $33 million APY on his deal versus the rookie contract quarterback who will be making 3 times less than that. It means that you can add 2 or 3 significant contributors to your team through free agency. And that is really helpful for these teams when they're building around their young quarterback. We saw it with the Eagles with Jalen Hurts, like we talked about when we hosted this show before. And we're going to continue to see it as long as these teams keep drafting quarterbacks highly in the first round.
Yeah, and so okay, so explain that a little bit. Again, we know that people who are listening to this are probably big football nerds, but it's okay to cover our bases and hit our foundations. What do you mean by surplus value in terms of rookie quarterbacks? Because rookie quarterbacks might not perform at the same level as Patrick Mahomes. I don't think that's a bold statement to say. So, what do you mean by surplus value, and specifically the most tangible benefit of surplus value, which is team building and context around that?
Yeah. So due to the draft and like the rookie contracts that last at least 4 years with the 5th-year option, there's a set value for how much you have to pay a quarterback on their rookie contract. But their production could be anything, right? Like their production could be as good as a top 5 quarterback. It could be one of the worst in the league. But since they are being paid the 17th highest out of all quarterback contracts, if they perform over that level, if their EPA per play or their general production and kind of how you see them in the pecking order is above 17th, they are starting to generate surplus value for their team. Where in a the most efficient market where a player is paid exactly 1-to-1 for their production, they are going to get more money than if they were not on their rookie contract. But instead, since they're locked into that deal for 4 to 5 years, they're being paid, they're being underpaid, and the team can reap the benefits of them being underpaid by being able to get players from other directions because they have excess money.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's a huge team building component that we're really kind of understanding now is just that 4 years of rookie contract on quarterbacks allows you to be aggressive and go make big trades. Looking at the Eagles here, to get pieces that you need to really raise the ceiling. So I think that brings up kind of an interesting question specifically about team building around quarterbacks, which is a quarterback adjacent question, but it's not impossible to win without a rookie quarterback, right? Like obviously we know that you can win with veteran quarterback, and even in recent years, Pat Mahomes this year. But team building, like recent history and of who's been successful, there does seem to be some kind of optimal strategy for getting your team set up in a certain way that the quarterback is all you need to get past the threshold, and then finding that quarterback, which I think is a little bit counterintuitive to how a lot of people think about the draft, which is go get the best quarterback and then he'll raise your floor, and then you can start putting pieces there to raise the ceiling. But on the flip side, I think it's a lot more strategic to think about the flip side. This might just be a Jets question, I think, is really where I'm going with this. But are there really any teams who are a quarterback away, or is it the idea that if you can just get your quarterback, you can build around him and kind of set up from there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this year I don't know if there are necessarily a team that's a quarterback away from being considered, let's say, like a top 6 or top 8 favorite to win the Super Bowl. But there certainly are teams that again, like you mentioned, like the Jets that have this roster in place, this infrastructure in place, that where if we saw them with a quarterback last year, like it doesn't even have to be a top 5 quarterback, but could just be between 5 and 12 best quarterback in the league. They really could have gotten to the playoffs, made some noise with the way that their defense is playing and their supporting cast. And that's where I think it comes down. It has to start with like what the Bears should do at number 1 overall. Like I think some people argue that they do have their quarterback and they should be trying to build around Justin Fields and making sure that he has the opportunity to succeed in Chicago. And then there's other people that argue that they should be looking to trade Justin Fields, drafting Bryce Young or whatever quarterback they have atop of their board at number 1 overall, and getting the 2 extra years of the rookie contract to work with, because Justin Fields is already in the 3rd year of his deal, but if you drafted a rookie quarterback, he'd be in his 1st year of his deal. So I'm curious to see where you kind of stand on that whole trade-off that the Bears are going to have to make here.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question, simply because it's a philosophical question. I don't know if there's a right answer, right? There might be multiple strategies that work for different reasons, and it's kind of which one is the most sure strategy, kind of ex ante, before we know anything else. I looking at Ben Brown at PFF has this team WAR produced wins above replacement for 2022 season. The Bears were 1.82 in team wins above replacement overall. They were 1.66 WAR without their quarterback, suggesting that Justin Fields, doing a little bit of back of napkin math, was worth less than a fifth of a win to the Bears this season. That doesn't mean that he can't improve. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to, do better if they increase their surroundings with him. But it does suggest that their surrounding cast is not as good as you would hope to be, quote unquote, a quarterback away. I look at, for instance, the 49ers, 5.21 WAR without the quarterback, 6.58 overall. The other really, really high one that just escaped me as I was looking at this list is the Eagles, 5.44 and 8.67 overall. So they're really high surrounding, and then the quarterback kind of takes them over the top as well. So Ravens 4.04, but 5.48, including the quarterback there as well. So some really good surrounding context. The Bears really fall short of that, and they have needs at all over kind of everywhere. I think that if we talked about the loser's curse and whether that, we brought that up earlier, whether that still applies or whether that's still a real thing, I would be looking to trade down in this situation because you do have Justin Fields. Also because there are 2, maybe 3 quarterbacks, if you count next year's draft class, that you could potentially do. And so I think if you're looking at this at a time horizon, you have to say our surrounding context is not so good that, Patrick Mahomes could fix this team. Right. And so we've got to do a lot of building there. I also think that I would rather pursue some high quality skill pieces and then try to get a Drake May or a Caleb Williams next year than potentially try my hand with a Will Levis or an Anthony Richardson, pending, where they trade back and could get to. If you can't get younger Stroud, which at first you can get whatever you want, you got to trade back and then see if you can get that. I think you might be better off maximizing your draft capital and trying to build around the quarterback next year, kind of raising the ceiling. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I like that point. I think Young especially is kind of rose to the top of the draft class here. And I like Stroud a lot, and we'll get into Levis and Richardson when we dig into this. But when we were kind of brainstorming for this episode, the Bears case is special because they can choose whatever quarterback they want at number 1. And if they trust their scouting, they can roll with it. For teams that need quarterbacks but aren't picking number 1, the Texans, the Colts, and the Panthers, who are picking at 2, 4, and 9, respectively, they are either going to have to sit at their spot and hope the quarterback they like falls for them, or they're going to have to trade resources to go up and get the quarterback that they want. And so we know that there are the 4 top quarterbacks in this class, 4 quarterbacks that have been continuously mocked in the top 15, top 10 of the draft. And there are these 4 teams, the Bears, Texans, Colts, and Panthers, that are picking in the top 10, that the latter 3 need quarterbacks, and the Bears could take a quarterback. But then you also have the Raiders at number 7, the Falcons at number 8, the Titans at number 11, who should probably take a quarterback, or shop the offseason market for a quarterback, whether it's through a trade with a veteran quarterback or through the draft. And then that's where it gets complicated for a team like the Panthers, where if you're sitting at number 9 and you're worried the Raiders or the Falcons are going to take that quarterback in front of you, you're going to have to eventually trade up and leapfrog them. And then you might not even get a quarterback that is your top prospect, or even your second prospect, depending on how the board falls. So I think it gets really complicated for these teams here. I think the Bears have more of a simple decision. If they really like whoever their quarterback 1 is, they could probably take them and roll with it and get a decent amount of resources for Fields and reset that whole rookie contract window. But for all these other teams, it's a lot tougher to probably take your second or third favorite quarterback prospect.
Yeah, the drop off, I think, especially this year, is pretty stout, and that it is interesting. One, from a completely non-football standpoint, just kind of like the political economy and PR nightmare of the Bears having to be very careful about what they signal, because any direction either way just eliminates a ton of leverage for them on either side of this equation. It does seem a little bit ambitious to me to think, hey, we drafted a quarterback who by all the metrics was very, very good and, hit our bars. We liked him as recently as 2 years ago. We can do something different with a guy who's going to at best be the same for us there. I don't know what you think would be necessarily different from the Bears if the surroundings don't get better for whoever's playing quarterback there. But I imagine you can kind of bid these teams against each other and leverage a little bit the idea that I'm of the opinion that it's Bryce Young is the real prize. And then there's 3 guys who potentially could work out in the right, have a high ceiling, could work out in the right scenario. It depends a lot on how those teams value them, of course, as well. But I don't know that it's worth it necessarily on its own to reset the rookie clock and get rid of Fields for Bryce Young, especially knowing what's coming down the pipe next year with some of these quarterbacks.
I could definitely be talked into going with the delay for May route, or whatever the Caleb Williams equivalent is.
Are we going with waiting for Williams?
Waiting for Williams, yeah. But I think the Bears is interesting because this is a new regime that didn't draft Justin Fields, right? You have Ryan Poles in here instead of Ryan Pace. So they might not be fully committed to Fields long-term, but I can see really an argument for both sides. And Bryce Young is a really good quarterback prospect. Justin Fields was a very good prospect. From the time that he came out of high school. In college, he was tremendous. And then when he was drafted into the league, I think he was highly respected by a lot of people that dive deeply into all this stuff. And last year, he showed this really high-end rushing ability, which is probably why the Bears are going to keep him going into year 3. But I could see why they would want to take a quarterback there, and the benefits of kind of the money perspective, and how long the Bears kind of feel out from their window of trying to compete again and trying to make the playoffs and try to get to their Super Bowl odds in the top 8 and everything.
Yeah. Okay, we're about halfway. I think we're about to dive into the individual quarterbacks who I'd like to talk about at length here to kind of for the second half of this podcast. Before we do that, I do see a couple questions in the comments, so I thought we would hit those as a brief interlude, and then we could maybe get some more if we have them at the end as well. So first question, Amber Gribbins says, how do you, I think she was talking about my statement about it's hard to attribute strength of schedule and quality receivers and quarterback and everything in college. So that their question is, so how do you attribute presumably the value or the quality of a quarterback to the wide receiver versus the quarterback? Tej, I'll let you go first on that. How do you separate out a quarterback from a wide receiver? Be as technical as you feel comfortable doing, but also, whatever you think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the questions. My answer to almost everything is to create a model for it. So that's what I would do and have done before for trying to separate quarterback from receivers, especially college to pro. And so when I created my college completion percentage over expected model, the second most important factor in the model after pass depth was how open the receiver was. And when you can kind of throw this into a machine learning model to get a prediction for the percent chance that a pass should be completed with the pass depth and how open the receiver is, and then all the game situation stuff, you can see how important that openness to the receiver is for kind of completing these passes. And when you adjust for that, when before the first iteration of the model that I created, Justin Fields had the highest completion percentage over expected in 2014 to 2020 at the time. But then once I was able to get the new data that had the openness of the receivers, due to Ohio State's receivers being so well, he moved from the highest ever to just slightly above average. So I think that's a good example of showing like how important receivers can be, especially at the college level, for kind of raising your completion percentage and adjusting for all that, the factors that go into that.
Yeah, and it's not as easy as, I can divvy up 50% of a completion to the receiver, 50% to the quarterback, but it is almost as straightforward as that, is saying like, how much do I think the receiver benefited a quarterback? I think it's really important to look at, to have a mental model, to have an actual technical model, and say I need to do some way to isolate the variation of quarterback and attempt and defense and receiver. But it's also really important to remember that the quarterback receiver combo matters a whole lot in determining the array of potential plays that a quarterback can run, the throws he's asked to make. So I think when we talk about quarterbacks here, the second half, Tage is going to mention CPOE, and I'm going to ask about what was the expected completion percentage, right? Because I think the expected completion percentage tells us a signal of what the coach asked the quarterback to do, and the completion percentage over expectation gives us an idea about the execution of that. I think it's really important to look at the types of throws a player is looking at. A lot of people will say, let's take out screens, let's take out play action and see how well am I doing? Because a lot of times receiver athleticism can mask, can help with those, can look at some of those throws. Metrics like on target percentage are getting more and more available compared to just basic completion percentage, which gives us, again, a little bit more signal about did the receiver make a catch, is less important than did the quarterback put it where the receiver could get the catch. But again, selection matters there as well. And so with the receivers, I think you really have to do a little bit of thinking. And that goes into kind of something you said at the beginning, Tage, just about how I don't think you can solve a quarterback problem without a deep dive into the numbers or a deep dive into the film. I think that there's a lot of people who have a strong opinion that you need one or the other, but they should really both be a launching point. So I think you could look at, hey, Justin Fields has a really high CPOE. When I adjust that for receivers, that goes way down. Why? And that leads you to look at, okay, I'm going to go watch him and watch the receivers and watch what they're doing, and kind of give you some differences there. But yeah, you're going to, any adjustment for the receiver is going to be some kind of mixed effects model. And there's trade-offs to that for sure.
Yeah.
Let's look. Jim Monk says, will be interesting to see how Fields plays this year with all the scramble yards. Absolutely. He had the most scrambles in the NFL last year by a good amount, and led in scramble yards, 721, had 200, almost 200 yards of scrambling more than Josh Allen in 13 more attempts. So that's a lot of fun. I agree. Hello, Fraser Lamont. And then, okay, one more question we have, and then we'll talk about the quarterbacks. Carados Sports says, what would Fields fetch on the market for the Bears this offseason? What do you think? So if the Bears were going to trade Fields, Tage, what kind of return are they looking at?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question here as well. I think that Justin Fields would fetch a later first, like after pick 16 until 31, and also some sprinkled in day 2 or day 3 picks. When you look at where Fields was taken, like earlier in the first round, and then what he's done in the league, he's probably lost some value due to maybe his passing not being as good as people expected, and having those 2 years of his rookie contract gone. Take a shot every time I say rookie contract on the show, but when you look at still when you look at still his like athletic ability and like the ceiling that he has, and the prospect that he was, I think that a later first round pick and like maybe a day 2 and day 3 pick on top of that should be something that is given up for Fields.
Which is interesting to me because there are like a Could you get a Paris Johnson? Could you get a Brian Brees? Could you bring in like Jordan Addison, Miles Murphy, Jackson Smith? I mean, there's a lot of guys in the late rounds here who I think have a really, really high ceiling that are projected to go in those like those teens where, hey, this might be really, really a really nice haul for them overall if they can't do as well with, you know, with trading the first pick. Certainly going to involve draft capital next year, which is a different story. So yeah, I agree. I think that's about right. Is some kind of mid pick and then some padding. For sure. I'm interested to see what they will do. Regardless of what they do, someone has to take a quarterback. Somebody's got to draft these players. Tage, let's talk about the top 4 or 5 guys who are kind of on the radars here. One, I want to give a shout out to our friend JT O'Sullivan at QB School. I watch basically every video he puts out, especially around draft season. Just a really good digestible way to watch the game and get some commentary on it, and then, you know, make your own assumptions and kind of fill in the gaps as you're watching and learn a little bit about football. So I know that most of the film that I have watched has been because I've watched a JT O'Sullivan video and jumped off of that and gone down a rabbit hole looking for something specific. So expected draft position number 1, presumably number 1 overall, if we didn't know which team was picking and what the specific team needs were here, is Bryce Young from Alabama. Tage, tell me about Bryce Young. Maybe had his better season in 2021, but 2022 still was not bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and JT O'Sullivan for me is like a Ratatouille situation where I'm not really watching the film, like he's kind of guiding me through it. So I really appreciated his videos on all these prospects, and we'll talk about it today. But yeah, Bryce Young and you know, our friend Benjamin Robinson at Grinding the Mocks does have him as the number 1 overall pick. As projected right now, like you mentioned. And, you know, in looking at him just in 2022, like 83.7 QBR, which was 6th best in the league. He had a 12.5% pressure to sack rate, which was in the top 30 amongst quarterbacks. And when you break down where his passing location is, I think he was the best intermediate passer in the entire country this past season. And when you look at the numbers in that specifically, he had a 72.2% adjusted completion rate on passes that went 10 to 19 air yards. And he's also a good deep passer on top of that. 50% adjusted completion rate on 20 plus yard passes. So basically that's a lot of numbers to say that he's pretty good at avoiding sacks. And we know that he can scramble pretty well, but he can also pass the intermediate and the deep ball well. And the biggest concern about Justin Fields this draft season is going to be his size, whether he's 5'9", 5'10". We still don't know effectively until the combine, but it didn't really stop him much in college to be more of a shorter quarterback. And he's still able to get into middle of the field passing concepts better than most shorter quarterbacks like Russell Wilson that we've seen in the past, like aren't able to do. And so that's why I like Bryce Young a lot, is because he can maneuver the passing lanes to make sure that he's not throwing into his offensive lineman or his balls are getting batted down. His ability to kind of move around and his spatial awareness really helps him from a perspective of being able to basically overcome somewhat of a height deficit compared to other quarterbacks.
Yeah. I mean, certainly his ability to extend under pressure is maybe that's underrated. I said certainly, but I'm going to, maybe it's underrated. On his under pressure throws, time to throw is 4.12 compared to 2.49 on his kept clean drives. Like he just can move around so comfortably and make things happen. And his body, I think the Texas game this year is really what I liked a lot about, like the way he puts his body in certain positions and the ball can go other places. I'm not making a player comp to Mahomes. I'm just saying the kind of crazy throws that Mahomes does, Bryce Young is tapping into that vein in some way, shape, or form as he's making some of these really impressive throws. And so I think he's undoubtedly great. I do think that we do have some concerns about size, but that would be more of a concern if he was running a whole lot more, like designed runs and the durability constant. I think if he can escape and can create, like we've talked about, which he can, he only scrambled 29 times this season. And so in one design run, as we mentioned, so it's not like he's in a position where he's going to be lining up and taking a ton of hits. That certainly changes. I think that changes how you should think about the size issue as well. I don't know what in what ways would that be limiting beyond just the physicality of the game.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, like I do think that the middle of the field passing game sometimes does go down when you have shorter quarterbacks. But I'm old enough to remember when people had, and this is a different position, but there was a Heisman winner from Alabama that was smaller for their position than we basically ever seen in the NFL, and Devontae Smith, and he's done well, like he's done really well. And I think like people are going to overthink this Bryce Young size concern thing when you have to remember at the end of the day, he's a very good football player. And he's one of those players where you trust him to go get a bucket in these huge situations. I think to that final drive in the Texas game where it was one of the worst supporting casts I think I've ever seen from an Alabama team in recent Nick Saban kind of tenure there. And there were multiple passes dropped by receivers. The offensive line wasn't holding up. But that last drive, he was able to lead Alabama into field goal range to win that game against Texas. And then the same thing in the Tennessee game where he was just going stride for stride with the super explosive Tennessee offense. And that last drive, Alabama ended up missing the field goal, but he led them into that spot by a combination of hitting those intermediate passes and then also scrambling. So he's the type of special player I think where he can really just capitalize on everything that's given to him. And I think like when you mentioned with Mahomes, like it's so hard to come up for a comp for Bryce Young. Like, is he a smaller Joe Burrow? Is he a skinnier Russell Wilson? Like he's kind of like a one of one from just like a prospect clustering standpoint where he just stands out once you put everything together between the size, the production, and the measurables.
Yeah, and the limitations of surrounding cast, I think, are really really bode well for what he can potentially do because one, if he gets drafted early, he's going to go to a team that's not great, so there's going to be some learning curves there. But he's also going to, he's going to be on a roster with 12 with 40 NFL guys, and that's going to be interesting to see how they can support him and he can create. I'm specifically thinking about the Texans, and so trying to not say anything specific about them and about their team and what they need. But I think that he fits in at any of these top spots in a way that immediately helps raise your ceiling of kind of your guys surrounding him. The size issue, yeah, I mean we've seen varying returns on that ability. I think if he was a borderline guy, I would look at size and say, okay, maybe this is something that's going to be a concern. But given that he's so far on the tail, I don't know how that's disqualifying necessarily. Let's move on to the next one on the expected draft board here from Grinding the Mocks is Ohio State's CJ Stroud. Before we get to even the first order stats, I want to talk about their offense for just a second. When they played Georgia, which I think is about as close to an NFL defense as a college team is going to see this year, Stroud hit 4 receivers that were responsible for 95% of targets and 95% of the yards. They only threw the ball to 6 people total.
Wow.
And so it wasn't like they were slinging the ball, but they weren't spreading out. They were saying, we know how to find these matchups. We're going to get the ball to our guys in matchups. I thought that was really, really impressive that it wasn't necessarily some kind of, junk ball, run around, make something happen. It was, hey, we know where we want the ball to go. And generally we can get our guys there in most situations, if not all situations, especially there at the end. So was really impressed with his ability. Of course, as you mentioned in like completion percentage talk, he was certainly benefited by one of the better wide receiving cores with some really, really talented guys, even as they were limited throughout the season. He is someone who I think has a little bit more variance than Bryce Young. Doesn't have the passing in the pocket ability, or excuse me, the passing under pressure, escaping the pocket ability of Young, but is really, really good with the deep ball. Over 50% adjusted completion on balls 20 plus yards downfield, playing against some really stout Big Ten defenses is very impressive.
For sure. And what I want to ask you about is how can we, and Amber asked about this too briefly, but in Stroud's case specifically, how can we approach kind of evaluating him compared to how good those Ohio State receivers were? Because he did have 10.3 yards per attempt, which is second best in the country. I thought Stroud was amazing against Georgia, one of the best performances we've seen by a losing quarterback. But Marvin Harrison Jr. was too. And how much of that do we attribute to each other. And his 7% big time throw rate from PFF is the 11th best in the country, which is probably a quarterback stat, but also could be factored in by these wide receivers getting down the field more. So when you look at Stroud versus kind of the receivers that he had, Ryan Day's play calling, do you feel a little bit less sure about him compared to someone like Bryce Young because the supporting cast wasn't as good and maybe the play calling wasn't there as well?
Yeah, so you think about like the Ohio State versus Michigan game, they only scored 23 points and looked kind of stuck overall. But generally, I mean that's one, the whole offense like matters, the game state matters, and when your when your offense is reduced to one dimension, and it's certainly harder to to kind of capitalize. And Michigan was a very, very good defense there. So I don't know that I'm ready to throw Ryan Day out with the bathwater as so many fans were after that loss. But I think that it'd be hard to penalize him for the quality of receiver play, especially when the way they're running the offense, he's not throwing the ball to wide open receivers 100% of the time. Like I do a couple of metrics just looking at like wide open percentage. So how often when they charted the data were you wide open, or was a receiver had 3 yards of separation? And he doesn't rate very highly on that. He's just, there are guys who are throwing to all class wide receivers and just chucking it and getting the ball to them, and it's working out really well. Stroud is historically, or at least this season, has not really been one of those. And so, I think that it'd be hard for me to penalize him for the receivers. You also look at, I mean, how many of them were hurt and in and out and limited over the season. He did have Marvin Harrison and he had Amika all season for the most part, but they really wanted to have more guys, wanted the offense to go through JSN a little bit more, and he really couldn't play at all. And so I think that I don't know that I'm going to penalize a guy for throwing to NFL receivers in an offense that is not necessarily just chuck it and go, right? Like there's a little bit of complexity there that I think matters. But it is interesting to look at he has the intermediate passing as well. That's not as great, and the number really, really falls, from to 58.6 just to completion. And I think that the selection issue of when he's throwing deep and when he's throwing short really, really matter. And so if I was looking at him to evaluate him, I'd really have a lot more questions about looking at the variation in their schedule and saying, okay, when was the timing of these deep balls? Was he racking these up against, a single matchup? Then yeah, I'm going to give the wide receiver a little bit more credit on those overall. But generally, it's hard to penalize a guy for throwing to NFL wide receivers.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was just approaching that from a perspective of someone who might want to have a reason to be out on Stroud, but when you look at his expected completion percentage from the past year, he was expected to complete 66.1% of his passes, which ranked 108th out of 190 qualifying passers in college last year, and he completed 68.4%, which was a plus 2.3% completion percentage over expected. So even though those receivers were open, we saw he was attempting these deeper passes more often than most quarterbacks, which is why that expected completion percentage is lower than you probably would have thought. And then just from an efficiency standpoint, an 87.7 QBR was third best in the country last year. And from just a passing standpoint, I think he can pass the ball as anyone. I think his arm strength is really, really good. We saw the accuracy and the tight window throws really come out in that Georgia game. And you don't lead the most efficient passing offense in the country by accident. And CJ Stroud showed the ability to do that. So I think while there will be a lot of talk about Bryce Young's size or Will Levis's inconsistencies or Anthony Richardson's low kind of sample size data, Stroud might get lost in this whole process because he's just a pretty good quarterback prospect that doesn't necessarily do anything super flashy or have any alarming red flags, but he also doesn't have many flaws in his game. And I think that's what's going to make this discussion interesting is draft season is really long, and we're going to see how much people are going to hold on to their priors of hit the whole body of work that he's had in the 2 years at Ohio State, but especially that most recent game against Georgia where he dominated. And we're going to see how that kind of carries with him throughout the draft season.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's plenty of reasons I would say, again, caution you to say, hey, if I found a number that stands out, like the intermediate passing, I have some questions about CJ Stroud. I would like to go back and look and watch a game with that stat in mind and say, okay, what are they doing that's different? What's happening there, to either confirm that or kind of round out that prior. All right, we're at 50 minutes. Let's hit the last two here. We'll talk about Levis and we'll talk about Richardson a little bit quicker than we have the first two. Tage, I'm not saying Will Levis is bad. I'm not saying he won't ever be an NFL quarterback. I'm saying I don't understand it. I don't understand that he's been this highly rated. I don't understand the talk about the inevitability of him being a really number one kind of prospect, a long-term NFL starter with what we've seen. Talk to me about Will Levis. Explain this to me.
Okay, so I'm with you and kind of in the hive mind, I think, on Twitter that Will Levis is not a great quarterback prospect, not worthy of a top 10 pick. But I tried to sit back and kind of pitch Will Levis to myself, or if I was a consultant, I had to pitch Will Levis to a team that wanted him in particular, and they wanted to hear some reaffirming thoughts about him. And here's what I came up with. Like, first of all, the arm strength is phenomenal, and you're not going to beat that. And I don't think you can necessarily teach arm strength. I think accuracy, while it's pretty stable college to pro, is something that you can kind of teach with mechanics, but you're given the arm that you have and kind of the strength that comes with it. And I think that Levis has that box already checked off. And then on top of that, he was playing injured in 2022 and the play calling was really bad. And I also don't think the supporting cast was good, right? So you have the 67th best pass blocking offensive line by PFF. You have Coach Bass on Twitter saying that Levis should only be evaluated on 2021 instead of 2022 because of the play calling and because of the supporting cast. But what I keep coming back to with Levis is he just didn't produce, right? Like 60.4 QBR was 61st in the country. And then like the biggest thing about him was his pressure to sack rate was 26.8%, 130th out of 140 qualifying quarterbacks. And if you have a guy that's going to be taking that many sacks from into the NFL, it's going to be really hard to build an offense around. But maybe because of the things that I mentioned when I was trying to pitch him to myself, I could see a team getting talked into kind of the aurora about Levis, but it's going to be pretty hard for, I think, draft Twitter to get talked into him.
Yeah, it's hard because there are strong opinions, and I think that we certainly need to be mindful of college surroundings, and there can be limitations, absolutely. But one of the key elements in like a little toy model I've had of draft pick placement has been year-to-year improvement because college football development cycles are so important. And I don't think that like Will Levis necessarily by the numbers stayed the same. Or even just treaded water. Like he wasn't creating given the situation that he had, which is really hard because again, raw tools are raw tools, and maybe in the NFL they can be worked on. It's hard for me to throw out something entirely. It's hard for me to throw out the entirety of the season without specifics. So I know there's a couple games where it's like, okay, he had a finger, he had a toe, and we can say, okay, that's fine. He had a finger, he had a toe. We can look at that and we can talk about that. But also, he played in all of those games and he had all season to learn the system. And I don't know that like we should necessarily, in absence of evidence of someone being great, I don't know that we should have give them the benefit of the doubt of being great if we have evidence to the contrary, right? I don't know. That's kind of a convoluted way to say this, but like I've seen a lot of like these are all jokes on Twitter, but like Will Levis and Joe Burrow conversations about like, well, look at someone's college career, it can change. And it's like, well, yeah, but we were talking about Joe Burrow in the draft after he had the greatest season in college football history. And you could say a lot of things about Will Levis's 2022. You cannot say it was the greatest season in college football history. So my question with Levis is the expected completion percentage. That's what I want to know and talk about for a second, because I think they did a lot in that offense that could have potentially benefited him, and maybe there's just a mismatch of touch and skill there.
Mhm. Yeah, so pulling up the numbers, Levis had an expected completion percentage of 68.2%, which ranks 68th out of the 190 qualifying quarterbacks that I have here. He actually completed 70.5% of his passes. So we also have a plus 2.3% CPOE, a completion percentage over expected for Levis, which I think is interesting because a lot of his problems are probably in the sack department, like we were talking about earlier. The passing department, he actually might be okay in that aspect. And another thing that I found was interesting was he had 11.3 yards per attempt off play action and 7.4 yards per attempt on non-play action passes, but was given play action at a lower rate than any of these other four quarterbacks that we're talking about today. So maybe they didn't utilize him great, but again, like it comes back to like his completion percentage might look higher because he's only attempting passes where he doesn't take a sack, and he was taking sacks so often that I think that there's some selection bias in play here.
Yeah, and I think that again, opponents matter, and I don't want to write any programs off um, summarily. But if you look at his very good games, they were Northern Illinois, they were Mississippi State, who really fell off
Yeah.
towards the end. They were even Miami, Ohio this year, and not necessarily the SEC teams that were that an NFL prospect should dominate against. Even last year, just looking at the ones that stand out, yes, he did great against Vanderbilt, against Missouri, against Louisiana Monroe, and against the Louisville team that wasn't excellent there. So I think that if we're buying Will Levis, we're buying the potential, we're buying that they can teach him the touch, we're buying that. In the right situation with the right timing, he can develop into a great quarterback. That's hard for me because the expectation is that if you get drafted in the top of round one, you're the starter, right? I think that's been pretty consistently what you're getting drafted for. And so the two sides of the two edges of the knife there kind of feel like either Will Levis, his best case scenario is getting drafted and maybe developing for a year, but the reality is that he's so highly touted because of that. He's going to get in a situation where he's going to have to start year one and be in a bad situation, and that might be bad. Best case scenario, maybe he gets drafted somewhere kind of like Jacksonville, where Trevor Lawrence didn't certainly get a mulligan, but got a lot of goodwill from kind of the coaching change and starting anew, and has turned into something great. So Levis is interesting to me. I'm just intrigued as to where it comes from overall, but will be interesting to watch as kind of a natural experiment to say like, hey, can we really write off an entire season of college football and still learn something about a prospect going forward? The last one, our agent of chaos, Anthony Richardson, his expected draft position is 12. I could see him falling because, man, he can do a lot of fun things, but he is pretty erratic. High variance quarterback is Anthony Richardson, and not always in the positive variance sense that kind of seems to jive well with success in college football.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. I think Anthony Richardson's going to be one of the more interesting quarterbacks to talk about in this draft class. And it comes back to like, how much do you want to bank on traits? Because the production wasn't necessarily there. I think it took him 4 weeks to have a passing touchdown in 2022, which is okay, right? Like if you're getting touchdowns other way, that's fine. But it's just something interesting to note. He had expected completion percentage of 64.8% in 2022, which ranked 136th out of the 190. And so that made his completion percentage over expected negative 2.5%. So he was a below average passer in college last year, but his scrambling ability, his design rushing ability, and then having one of the best pressure to sack ratios in the country, having a 9.2% pressure to sack ratio, where that was 11th best in the entire nation, I think is something that makes Anthony Richardson a really exciting quarterback. And he's another quarterback that might need another year to kind of learn the ropes of the NFL. But when you have that innate rushing ability and the ability to avoid sacks at the level that he does, he's going to turn a lot of plays that other quarterbacks would take negatives on into positives. And that should make NFL teams really excited if they can clean up some of the passing accuracy issues. I think JT O'Sullivan mentioned in a lot of his film breakdowns of Anthony Richardson that his feet and his footwork are something that can be fixed and are off right now. So if a team believes they have the infrastructure in place to do that, I think Richardson could be one of the more exciting prospects in this class to get on your team if you feel like you're in that ability to do so.
Richardson and Levis kind of feel like two sides of a coin.
Mm-hmm.
Where Levis has some of the traditional passing tool, although I mean Anthony Richardson could chuck the ball too. Not to say he doesn't have those passing tools, but Levis has those tools. Doesn't have kind of any of the soft skills of pressure mitigation that are correlated with success at the next level. And Richardson struggles in the kind of down to down business of throwing the football with some variance there, but is electric in his ability to extend plays. And so it does seem like they're kind of mirror image quarterbacks there in the inverse, that they both excel in kind of one area, but are pretty deficient in the other. Will be interesting to see what situation both of them land in. It could very well be the case that Levis gets taken by the Colts and they still need a lot for their team and doesn't do well. And Richardson gets drafted late in the draft by a team that's doing pretty well and falls in a good situation. I certainly wouldn't begrudge either quarterback. I wouldn't hold it against them for that situation, but that's a reality of just the draft and the nature of the loser's curse and being at the top of the draft overall. Yeah, Richardson is maybe is definitely more raw than Levis. I think situation matters so much here. I think he and Levis are certainly both past the threshold of talent for the potential to be a good NFL quarterback, but situation is going to matter a whole lot for either of those guys.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And that's why I think like a really good fit for Anthony Richardson is a team like the Lions, because you have Jared Goff there, and Jared Goff is probably going to be your starting quarterback week 1 of 2023. But if you kind of go the Chiefs route, and again, no one can replicate Mahomes, but you can try to come close to it. If you go the Chiefs route of Goff being there like Alex Smith was in 2017, and then kind of handing off the reins to Anthony Richardson, I think that's something that you could and probably should look into if you're a team like the Lions in that spot, or if you're the Titans and you still have Ryan Tannehill there and you want to take Anthony Richardson and kind of have him sit behind there as well, because you do need to start looking for a long-term quarterback there. I could see that as well. So I think there are teams kind of in that range right now with Richardson being projected to go 12th overall. And I do think that rises throughout draft season, and we'll have to end up seeing where he goes. But there are teams in that low teens that might jump up or might take Richardson and have them sit behind a quarterback that they have currently on the roster and hope to develop him to be a high-end quarterback when he's ready in year 2.
The Titans taking Richardson would be a real Eagles move there to say, look, we drafted Malik Willis last year. We have Ryan Tannehill, but we think we need something else and going and getting him. The Lions do have 2 draft picks at 6 and 18. Would you try and trade back from 6 if if one of the quarterbacks falls? If I think there's a lot of potential for what the Lions could do, or just say we're not going to draft a quarterback at 6 and we're going to see our options at 18. There's a lot of. What would you prefer? I guess I would say the Lions to do there. Not as a fan, just thinking strategically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I do think it would be in the Lions' best interest to strongly consider a quarterback at number 6 overall. If we kind of read the tea leaves of the draft, how it currently stands, and let's say the Bears aren't able to trade back, Bryce Young goes at number 2 to the Texans, and Will Levis goes at number 4 to the Colts. If you're sitting there with CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson to choose from, I think you're in a really good spot. And the Lions could choose either of them and be pretty happy with where they're at. They shouldn't wait until pick 18 to take a quarterback because of how important the position is. You shouldn't want to wait on other teams. And we know how good these top 4 quarterbacks all have the potential to be in the NFL. So I think that the Lions should consider that at 6. But if they do not decide to go the quarterback route, then trading back would be in their best interest. But it takes 2 to tango. You need another team to take up. And I'm sure it might be a tough pill to swallow for Brad Holmes and the Lions front office to maybe potentially give another team their franchise quarterback while you kind of trade back for non-quarterback pieces as you continue to build up your roster.
I like it. I like it a lot. I think that's Interesting. And there's infinite game theory scenarios you can go down of like, well,
Mm.
to what extent are we considering these kind of soft skills of like, obviously I'm not going to trade in division. I'm not going to, I don't want to help them get a guy who's going to plague me for the next 4 years and all that. So very, very fascinating kind of the soft skills, or the rather the kind of intangibles that talk about with the draft there.
It's the Princess Bride
Okay.
scene where he talks himself into not drinking the poison by kind of going through all these loopholes. That's exactly what draft season is. Do they want you to think
Exactly.
they're putting out a smoke screen, or are they actually putting out a smoke screen, or you can keep going down that hole there.
Exactly. I think of the the Oklahoma, the Mike Leach dropped the play call for them to find it,
Oh
so they
yeah.
knew it would be the wrong thing. It's like, what kind of draft, not tampering, not saying anything's doing anything wrong, but what kind of smoke signals are we floating out there to kind of play around with that? Man, that's over an hour. We're at hour 5 on quarterbacks and draft potpourri there. I think this has been a fun episode. Tej, thanks so much for joining me on this. I'm always glad when we get to podcast and chat and take a break from all the good work we're doing at Sumer Sports, building fun stuff for people to see hopefully soon, but get to pop over here and fill in and chat is always fun. Make sure you're following Tej on Twitter at Tej FB Analytics. I think I did that right. And follow me on Twitter at Stats of War. Of course, at Sumer Sports should be your hub for all things nerdy in football. Some really interesting draft conversations, charts, data, and insights over there. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube as well. Every number helps, and you can get the latest episodes. It is, to the best of my knowledge, Thomas and Eric will be back on Wednesday with another interesting episode. So make sure you tune in. Don't miss that. Other than that, thanks for tuning in. Be well.
Thanks, Parker.